The snow had been falling since noon. By the time Alara Voss finished her shift at the university library, the city had swallowed itself whole. Streets that she walked every day had disappeared beneath 6 inches of white, and the wind coming off the river had turned savage, the kind of cold that didn't just sting your skin, but reached through it, looking for something deeper to ruin. She stood at the library's back exit for a moment, her thin peacoat buttoned to the throat, her scarf wound twice around her neck, and still she felt the cold like a personal insult. She'd checked the forecast that morning. She always checked the forecast. The app had said light flurries, possible dusting. The app had lied. Alara pulled her bag higher on her shoulder and stepped out. The wind hit her like a wall. She ducked her head and started walking. 4 blocks to the bus stop. 4 blocks wasn't far on a normal evening, but tonight each step felt like a negotiation with the weather. The ground slick and uncertain beneath her boots, the snow coming sideways now instead of down, finding every gap between her collar and her jaw, between her sleeve and her glove. She made it 2 blocks before her fingers stopped working properly. She was trying to rebutton the top of her coat, the button she'd missed in her haste to leave, when she stepped on a patch of ice she hadn't seen under the fresh powder. Her ankle twisted. She didn't fall, caught herself against an iron railing that she gripped with both hands, but the bag slipped from her shoulder, and the contents of the front pocket scattered across the sidewalk. Her transit card, her lip balm, the small notebook she carried everywhere, a handful of coins that disappeared instantly into the snow. She stood there for a moment, gripping the railing with both hands, her heart hammering from the near fall, her ankle throbbing with a dull warning that it was not happy with her. "Perfect," she said to no one. She crouched carefully, gathering what she could find, pawing through the snow for the transit card, because without it she'd have to explain to the bus driver and fish for exact change, and she didn't have the emotional reserves for that tonight. Her fingers found the notebook, the lip balm, the coins she gave up on. She was still looking for the card when she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, unhurried. The kind of footsteps that didn't belong to someone fighting the same weather she was fighting. "You dropped this." She looked up. A man was standing on the sidewalk behind her, holding her transit card between 2 fingers. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of height that made her recalculate the scale of everything around him, dressed in a dark coat that reached his knees. No hat, no scarf. The snow landing in his dark hair and melting immediately, as if his skin ran warmer than the average person's. He had sharp features, the kind that belonged in oil portraits rather than snowstorms, and his eyes, when the light from the nearest street lamp caught them, were an unusual color, something between gray and pale silver that didn't quite look natural. He wasn't shivering. In 17 degrees and a wind chill that was making Alara's eyes water, this man was standing completely still, completely calm, the cold not touching him at all. She straightened up, her ankle protesting, and took the card. "Thank you." He nodded once, started to turn, and then he stopped, turned back, looked at her in a way that felt less like attraction and more like assessment, like a doctor cataloging symptoms, like someone trying to solve a problem they hadn't expected to encounter. "Your coat isn't adequate for this," he said. It was such a strange thing to say that she almost laughed. Not unkind, not condescending, just factual, the way someone might note that a window was broken or a door was hanging wrong. A statement of observable reality. "I know," she said. "I checked the forecast. The forecast was wrong." "Yes," I noticed. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the shadow of one. Something that had learned to live in the neighborhood of amusement without fully committing to it. He reached up and began unbuttoning his coat. Alara blinked. "What are you doing?" "Solving the problem. You can't give me your coat." "I'm not cold," he said simply. He said it the way someone might say water is wet, a self-evident fact requiring no further defense. He shrugged the coat from his shoulders. It was a heavy wool coat, dark charcoal, the kind of coat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, lined with something that released warmth the instant he held it out to her. "I'm a stranger," she said. "You're someone who's going to damage their immune system in the next 4 blocks. He kept the coat extended. "Take it. You can return it." She stood in the snow, her ankle aching, her fingers numb, looking at a beautiful stranger who was apparently impervious to 17-degree weather, holding out a coat that radiated warmth like a small furnace. Later, she would ask herself why she took it. She would tell herself it was the cold, that her hands had stopped working, and her common sense had stopped working along with them, that no rational person would have stood in that snowstorm and refused. She would tell herself it was practical, logical, a reasonable decision under difficult circumstances. But the truth, if she was honest, was that something about him felt safe in a way she couldn't explain and didn't entirely trust. His colors, she would think later, reaching for a word that wasn't quite right but was the closest she had. Something about the way he stood in the world felt still and certain and old, not threatening, just present in a way most people weren't. She took the coat. It settled around her shoulders like a decision, heavy and warm and smelling of cedar and something else, something dark and complex she didn't have a name for, something that felt less like cologne and more like the air inside a very old building, stone and time and dim candlelight. "Thank you," she said again. "There's a card in the left pocket," he said. "The address. For when you return it." She reached into the pocket, found a small card, heavy stock, no logo, just an address in the historic district and a name. Cassian Vielle. She looked up to ask how she'd know when he'd be there, when to come, whether she should call first. But the sidewalk behind her was empty. The snow fell into the space where he'd been standing, and there was nothing to show he'd been there at all, except the coat on her shoulders, and the card in her hand, and the faint, inexplicable certainty that the city she'd lived in for 6 years had just shifted somehow, had revealed a door she hadn't known was there. She walked the remaining 2 blocks to the bus stop. The coat kept her perfectly, completely warm. Not just warm. Something beyond warm. Like being held. She did not think about that on the bus ride home. She thought about it later, in her apartment, with the coat folded over the back of her desk chair, the card propped against her lamp. Cassian Vielle. She went to sleep thinking about silver eyes that hadn't flinched in the wind, and a man who'd stood in a blizzard like it was a mild inconvenience, and the particular weight of a coat that felt like it had been carrying the cold for centuries and had simply learned not to mind. She didn't plan to return it the next day. Her first thought, waking up with the gray morning light pressing through her curtains and her ankle wrapped in yesterday's bruise, was that she'd return it at the end of the week. There was no urgency. The coat was safe on her chair. The card was on her desk. She had work on Monday, a paper to finish, a reading list that had been quietly multiplying since the semester started, an inbox with 17 unread messages from her department supervisor, a life that had real demands and real timelines and no space in it for mysterious strangers in snowstorms. She made coffee. She opened her laptop. She looked at the card. Cassian Vielle, the address in the historic district, the part of the city that sat on the old hill above the river, the part where the streets were still cobblestone and the buildings still had their original stonework, and everyone who lived there had been there long enough that their names had stopped appearing in current records and started appearing in local history footnotes. She looked at the coat. She closed her laptop. She was going to return it today, because it was the right thing to do, and because keeping someone else's belongings made her uncomfortable, and because she was an archivist by training and by nature, which meant she had a fundamental commitment to returning things to where they belonged. That was the logic she assembled while she dressed in her warmest sweater and her repaired boots, while she folded the coat carefully over her arm and tucked the card into her pocket. It had nothing to do with the silver eyes. Absolutely nothing. The historic district was 40 minutes by bus and a 10-minute walk up a steep cobblestone street that had not been designed with winter in mind. Alara made it up the hill without incident, which she counted as a victory. The address on the card led her to a block she'd never visited despite 6 years in the city, a stretch of townhouses and larger buildings that sat behind iron railings and bare winter trees, everything slightly set back from the street, slightly removed from the normal world. Number 14 was at the end of the block. It was not a townhouse. It was something significantly larger than a townhouse. 4 stories of dark stone with tall windows and a carved wooden door that had been old when the rest of the city was young. Iron railings ran along the front. The garden beyond them was dormant now, winter stripped, but she could see the bones of it, the structure, the sense that in another season it would be extraordinary. She stood at the gate. There was an intercom. She pressed the button. Silence then, just when she'd started to feel foolish. A voice. Not Cassian's voice. A woman's voice. Precise and slightly cool. Name? Alara Voss. I'm here to return a coat. I ran into someone last night, in the snow, and the gate opened. Alara walked up the stone path, the door ahead of her opening before she reached it, and a woman appeared in the frame. Dark suit, pale complexion, the kind of posture that made the word staff appear in Alara's mind before she'd consciously thought it. She looked at Alara with the same assessing quality that Cassian had the night before, though without whatever had made his assessment feel safe rather than clinical. He said you'd come today, the woman said. Something about that made Alara stop walking. He said I'd come today? I didn't decide until this morning. The woman's expression didn't change. He said you'd come today because you'd find it uncomfortable to wait, that you'd want it returned properly. She stepped back from the door. Please come in. He'll be with you shortly. The interior of the house was not what she'd expected, and she hadn't been able to fully prepare for what she expected, because nothing about last night had given her a reliable framework for expectations. It was large and quiet, with high ceilings and floors that were old stone with rugs laid over them, dark wood banisters, walls lined with bookshelves so densely packed that the spines formed their own wallpaper pattern, oil paintings in heavy frames, a clock on the mantelpiece that was ticking so quietly, she felt it more than heard it. The whole space had the specific gravity of somewhere that had been accumulating things for a very long time. Books. She noticed the books the way she noticed everything cataloging, organizing, her archivist's brain automatically sorting and noting. The collection on the nearest shelf was in at least 4 languages. The spines ranged from obviously ancient to relatively recent, but the ancients were not behind glass the way you'd expect if someone were just collecting for display. They were accessible. They were used. You can set the coat there, the woman said, nodding to a side table near the entrance. I'd rather give it to him directly, Alara said. She wasn't sure why she said it. The woman's slight pause suggested she wasn't used to visitors having preferences about the manner of return. Of course, the woman said, after a beat. Can I bring you something while you wait? Tea? Coffee? Tea would be lovely. Thank you. The woman disappeared, and Alara was left alone in the entrance hall with the coat over her arm and the bookshelves and the quietly ticking clock, and the very particular feeling of being in a place that had weight, not oppressive weight, not threatening weight, but the weight of time, of things that had been here long before her and would be here long after. She was examining the spine of a 17th century Italian text when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Unhurried, measured, the same quality as the footsteps in the snow. She turned. Cassian Vael came down the staircase the way people come down staircases in old houses, which is to say slowly, with the ease of someone who knew every step, He was dressed differently than the night before, darker, quieter, a gray shirt with the collar open. No coat this time, but the quality of stillness was the same. The silver eyes were the same. The sense of being looked at by someone who was accustomed to looking at things very carefully and for very long periods of time. "You came today," he said. "You told your staff I'd come today." He didn't apologize for that. He simply accepted it as accurate. "Yes. How did you know?" He looked at her for a moment. "You left your own coat behind last night." She blinked. She had. She realized. Her peacoat was still on the railing at her apartment door, exactly where she'd thrown it when she got home. In the warmth of his coat, she'd simply forgotten about it. "Your own coat was wet through," he continued. "You'd need mine to get back today. I calculated you'd return it before you needed to leave again." It was such a logical explanation that it should have satisfied her completely. It did not satisfy her completely. There was something in the delivery of it, something in the particular quality of certainty he'd had when he'd told his staff this, that suggested he wasn't guessing. That suggested he had information about the way she was likely to behave that went beyond yesterday's brief, snowy exchange. She held out the coat. He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he said, "Your ankle from last night." She'd forgotten she'd twisted it. She hadn't been limping, or she thought she hadn't been limping. "It's fine." "It's not fine," he said. "You're compensating with your left side. Sit down." It was not a request framed as a request. It was a request framed as the obvious correct course of action, stated plainly, and with the calm authority of someone who had spent a very long time being correct about things. She sat down. The tea arrived before she had time to fully question why she was sitting in a stranger's entrance hall while he crouched in front of her and looked at her ankle with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. He hadn't asked permission. He hadn't made it feel invasive. He'd simply crouched, examined, and pronounced it a mild sprain that needed elevation and ice. "I have an ice pack," he said. "You don't need to." "Vera," he said, without raising his voice, and the woman in the dark suit appeared from around the corner, as if she'd been waiting there, which perhaps she had. "Ice pack. And bring it to the library." And that was how Alara Voss, archivist 28, recently sprained, found herself escorted down a corridor and into the most extraordinary private library she had ever seen. She stopped in the doorway. It occupied 2 stories of the building's interior, a full-height room with a mezzanine running around 3 walls, the lower level lined floor to ceiling with shelves, and the upper level accessible by a rolling ladder on a brass track. There was a fireplace lit, the fire burning low and steady, and 2 deep chairs positioned before it, and a large desk in the corner covered in what appeared to be maps, old ones, the kind drawn by hand on vellum rather than printed on paper. The smell of the room alone nearly made her emotional. Old paper, leather, the particular warmth of a fire in a cold house. Every archivist's private paradise rendered as architecture. "Sit," Cassian said. She sat in one of the chairs by the fire without remembering choosing to move. The fire was immediately, wholly welcome. She hadn't realized how cold she still was until the warmth found the places the cold had been hiding. Vera appeared with the ice pack. Alara arranged it around her ankle. Cassian took the other chair, crossed one leg over the other, and seemed entirely comfortable sitting in silence while she looked around his library and tried to process what she was seeing. "What do you do?" she asked finally. He considered the question longer than it seemed to require. "I manage certain old things," he said. "Estates, collections, properties that have been in existence for a considerable time and require certain kinds of oversight. Like an archivist," she said, before she'd thought about it. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention again. "A little like that. Yes, I'm an archivist," she said. "At the university library. Special collections and rare manuscripts." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Your bag," he said. "Last night. When your things scattered, I saw the university library staff lanyard. The level of distress you showed over the transit card versus the coins told me you were the kind of person who prioritized practicality and access over monetary value, which is consistent with someone whose professional relationship to objects is about use and cataloging rather than ownership. The notebook, the specific model of bag, which is standard issue for the university's special collections department." He paused. "And the way you looked at my books when you came in just now." Alara opened her mouth. Closed it. "You're observant," she said. "I've had time to learn how to be." It was an odd thing to say. She filed it alongside the other odd things, which were multiplying at a rate that would have alarmed her more if the fire weren't so warm, and the tea weren't so good, and the library weren't the kind of room she had spent her entire adult life believing should exist. "The address on your card," she said. "Vale? Is that the same Vale as in the Vale collection? At the Eastham Institute?" Something shifted in his expression. Very slightly. The way a door shifts when someone on the other side of it moves. "You know the collection. I've spent 3 months trying to access the collection," she said. "It's a private bequest from the early 19th century, a manuscript collection 1,500 pieces. The catalog suggests possibly older than that, possibly significantly older, but the terms of the bequest restrict access to credentialed researchers with specific institutional permission, and the Institute won't respond to my requests. I've written 4 letters." She heard herself speaking at a pace that probably suggested she had feelings about this. She did have feelings about this. "The collection potentially contains documents that would completely revise our understanding of how manuscript culture moved through the city in the medieval period. It's not an academic curiosity, it's genuinely significant." Cassian was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. 4 letters, he said. 4 letters. No response. "The collection is administered by my family," he said. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. "Of course it is," Alara said. Quietly, "The Institute's lack of response isn't indifference," he said. "The access terms exist because several of the documents in that collection are not," he stopped. "Chose new words with the care of someone selecting tools for a specific task. They're fragile in ways that go beyond the usual concerns. Their handling requires a level of contextual understanding that most researchers, however qualified, don't arrive with." "What kind of contextual understanding?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to one of the shelves on the far wall, and returned with a book. Not one of the ancient ones, this was older than that. The boards warped slightly with humidity, the leather rubbed to a sheen at the corners that suggested centuries of hands. He set it on the small table beside her chair. She looked at it without touching it. "Archivists have it you didn't handle without permission, without assessment. May I?" He nodded. She picked it up, opened the cover, slowly, with the particular reverence that old books demanded, and that some people found strange, and that had always felt to Alara like the most natural thing in the world. The text inside was handwritten, dark ink on vellum that had survived better than it should have, the script a style she recognized immediately, a type she had studied. "This is from the 12th century, she said. "This script style, this is pre-Carolingian influence. This is earlier than the standard shift in this region, by at least." She stopped. Looked more closely. Something about the text itself was making her brain recalibrate. The content wasn't what she'd expected. It wasn't devotional text, wasn't legal documentation. It was something else, a chronicle of some kind, detailed and specific, referencing places she recognized and events she didn't. Events that were described with the particular authority of an eyewitness account. "Can you read it?" Cassian asked. "Most of it," she said. "The dialect is unusual. There's a vocabulary I don't. She read a passage silently. Read it again. This person is describing the city in significant detail. But some of the detail is wrong, or it seems wrong. It describes the river before the 19th century engineering works, the old course, which would be correct for this period. But then it also mentions, she frowned. It mentions events that are dated 200 years apart, as if the author witnessed both. Yes, Cassian said. That's not possible. He didn't respond. Elara looked up from the book. Looked at him, at the silver eyes, at the absolute stillness, at the fire that threw warm shadows across features that were too precise, too permanent, too settled in themselves. At a man who had stood in a blizzard without shivering, who had known she would come today, who administered a manuscript collection that had been in his family since the 19th century using language that implied the family had been managing it for longer, much longer. "How old are you?" she asked. The room was very quiet. The fire made its small sounds. The clock ticked somewhere down the hall. "Old enough," Cassian said, "that I found it's usually better to let the books explain it first." She didn't leave. She should have. She had 17 unread emails. She had a paper with a deadline. She had a life that existed outside this room, that was waiting for her at the bottom of the cobblestone hill, orderly and familiar and entirely comprehensible. She didn't leave. She read. Cassian brought her more books, not all at once, 2 or 3 at a time, placing them on the table beside her, with the quiet deliberateness of someone building an argument. She read, and he sat across from her, and occasionally he answered questions, and occasionally he asked them, and the fire burned steadily down, and Vera appeared at some point, and replenished it without being asked, and refilled the tea without being asked, and the afternoon turned into early evening, with the specific stealth that short winter days used when you weren't paying attention. The Chronicle was what held her. She kept returning to it, setting other books aside, and coming back to that first one, the eyewitness text, reading and rereading the passages that didn't fit the expected pattern. An account of a plague in one decade, and an account of the same street's architecture 3 centuries later, rendered in the same handwriting, the same idiosyncratic spelling, the same specific focus on the river and the old district and the houses on the hill above the city. One author, she said finally. It wasn't a question. One author. The same person, writing across several centuries. Yes. She set the book down on her knee, looked at the fire, processed. She had spent her professional life with old documents, and old documents had taught her one very reliable lesson, which was that the simplest explanation for an anomaly was usually the correct one. If a document appeared impossible, it was usually because the date had been misdetermined, or there were 2 authors that had been conflated, or the provenance had been misrecorded somewhere in the chain. She had built a career on finding the simple explanations and demonstrating them with evidence. There was no simple explanation for the Chronicle, the collection at the Institute, she said. How much of it is like this? Some of it, he said. The more sensitive pieces. Sensitive because they document she stopped, started again. Sensitive because they're personal records. He looked at her carefully. You're not frightened, he said. It was an observation, not a question. And it was accurate. She noticed this about herself with a small degree of surprise. She should have been frightened. Every rational framework she possessed said she should be frightened. She was sitting in a house she'd entered on the basis of a card given to her by a stranger in a snowstorm, and that stranger was now sitting across from her, and had just essentially confirmed that the impossible thing she'd been reading was true. That there were people in the world who had witnessed 12th century plagues and 21st century city planning disputes, and written about both in the same hand. She wasn't frightened. She was riveted. Professionally, intellectually, entirely, I'm an archivist, she said. The entire point is preserving things that shouldn't have survived. I've spent my career hoping the impossible documents were real. She looked at the chronicle. This is the best thing I've ever read. Something in his face changed. It happened slowly, like weather changing. Not sudden, but unmistakable once you noticed it. The careful neutrality gave way to something that wasn't quite softness, but was adjacent to it, something that suggested he had expected a different response, and this one had caught him slightly off guard. Most people, he said when they reach this point in a conversation, want to leave. Most people probably aren't archivists. No, he said. They're not. She picked the chronicle back up. Who wrote this? My father. She looked up. Your father wrote a 12th century chronicle. My father began writing in the 12th century, he said. He continued for several hundred years. He was thorough. Is he? He died, Cassian said. Something shifted in his voice when he said it, the careful distance dropping fractionally, something underneath it that was not fresh grief but old grief, the kind that had been so thoroughly absorbed into a life that it barely showed anymore, the way water eventually smooths stone until the stone's original shape is barely visible. 300 years ago. Alara held that for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. The way he'd looked at her on the sidewalk in the snow, direct and assessing, but something different in it now. Something like being recognized by someone you hadn't expected to recognize you. Thank you, he said. He said it quietly. She had the sense that people didn't often say that to him about losses this old, either because they didn't know, or because time was supposed to have healed it to invisibility, and that her saying it meant something he hadn't anticipated. They sat in the firelight for a moment. What are you? She asked. Not unkindly. Not with fear. The way she'd ask the same question about a document whose origin she was trying to establish. What do you think I am? Old, she said. Very old. And not human in the way I'm human, but present in the world in a way that requires you to navigate it, to have addresses and staff and an institute that manages your family's collection. She paused. You eat. You clearly do. This house has a kitchen. You go out in the daytime. You were out last night. You didn't have to avoid the light. She thought of what she'd read. The chronicles mentioned certain details about nocturnal habits, about heightened sensory ability, about there's a passage about blood. I didn't want to assume vampire, he said. Plainly, the same way he'd said I'm not cold. A statement of observable reality requiring no additional defense. Right, she said. I thought so. He waited. Does it matter? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. That's an unusual response. I'm looking at your father's handwriting from the 12th century, she said. You kept him safe. The documents. All of it. She looked at the shelves around them. All those spines, all those voices, centuries of recording and preserving and keeping. You're a keeper of records. So am I. She looked at him. Does it matter what you eat? The fire shifted in the grate. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Outside, the day was finally surrendering fully to dark, the last light draining from the high windows. I should go, she said. But she didn't move. The documents in the Institute's collection, Cassian said. The ones you wrote 4 letters about. She looked at him. I could arrange access, he said, if you're prepared for what some of them contain. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to understand the question fully, which was not very long at all. When? She said, and something happened in his face then that she would think about on the bus ride home, and for the several nights after. Something that looked like a door, very old and very heavy, opening for the first time in a very long time. She came back 3 days later. She'd spent those 3 days finishing her paper, answering the 17 emails, wrapping her ankle properly, and trying to locate a rational framework for what had happened in the library on the hill. The framework kept collapsing. She'd built it up she'd met someone unusual. She'd been shown some remarkable documents. The rest was exhaustion and firelight and an overactive academic imagination, and then she'd remember the specific quality of stillness he carried. The way the snow hadn't bothered him, the chronicle written across 3 centuries in a single hand. The framework would collapse. She'd build it up again. She told her colleague Petra that she had a meeting about research access. Petra hadn't asked further questions because Petra was dealing with her own inbox, and also because Alara had a history of pursuing manuscript leads that other people found eccentric until they turned out to be significant. Petra had learned to trust the eccentric leads. The gate opened before she rang this time. Alara noticed this, filed it alongside the other things she was noticing about this house and its occupant, which was a growing list that she was beginning to organize under categories. The categories were things that might have ordinary explanations, things that probably didn't have ordinary explanations, and things she wasn't sure she was ready to fully examine yet. Vera met her at the door, led her not to the library this time, but through a different corridor, longer and quieter, towards the back of the house. A staircase she hadn't seen before. Down, not dark, she noted. The lower level was lit, good lighting, the kind of careful, warm spectrum illumination that archivists used to protect old documents and also be able to read them without straining. Temperature controlled, she realized as they descended she felt a shift in air quality, the slight coolness that meant climate regulation, the specific dryness that meant humidity control. The room at the bottom of the stairs took her breath away. It was smaller than the library upstairs, but more concentrated, a room built entirely around the function of preservation. Long, flat-topped tables for examination, small adjustable lamps positioned over each surface, drawers built into the walls rather than shelves, the kind of custom storage that bespoke archivists who knew what they were doing had specified to craftsmen who'd taken them seriously, and in the drawers, she understood the collection. Not the Eastham Institute's holding this was something else, something below the official record. This is separate from what the Institute holds, she said. The Institute holds what can survive public cataloging, Cassian said. He was already in the room. She hadn't heard him come down the stairs, hadn't heard footsteps at all, which was a thing she added to the list. This is what requires more careful handling. He moved to one of the drawer units along the far wall, opened a drawer with the specific gentleness that she associated with people who'd spent a long time learning the exact right amount of force for this particular task. Withdrew a document folder. Brought it to the nearest examination table. Alara sat, put on the cotton gloves she'd brought as a matter of professional habit. Opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of vellum. The writing on it was extraordinarily old. Not the quality of the chronicle upstairs, which had been impressive. This was something that the chronicle, she realized, had been trained by. The script was older, more effortful in its individual letters, the ink a different composition, the vellum scraped thin in the way that meant genuine age and material scarcity rather than aesthetic choice. She read. She read slowly, because the language was demanding in the way very old things were demanding, requiring her to hold multiple possible meanings simultaneously, to feel for the grammar rather than parse it cleanly. But it was a love letter. The words required adjustment from her, not because they were foreign, but because they were so immediate, so unguarded with feeling, that the distance she normally maintained between herself and historical documents simply wasn't available. Someone had written this. Someone had sat somewhere with this vellum and this reed pen and this particular ink, and had put down what they felt with the kind of precision that people only achieved when the feeling had been contained for a long time and had finally found a route out. She looked up. Cassian was watching her from across the room. "Who wrote this?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "The person it was written to," he said finally. "She was human." Alara looked back at the letter. "It's a declaration," she said. "It's not. This isn't romantic in the performative way. This is someone explaining their whole self. All of it, including the parts they knew might frighten her. "Yes," he said. She looked up again. "Did she stay?" He was quiet for a moment. "She stayed for 40 years, he said. Then, she died, as humans do." Another beat of that old grief quality, so absorbed it barely registered as grief, only as a slight increase in density around the words. She asked that the letter be preserved. So it was. Ilara looked at the letter, at the words that had survived because someone had thought to keep them, because someone had understood that keeping was its own kind of love. "You keep a lot of things," she said. "Yes, because you outlast them." She wasn't sure why she said it, but it seemed true, and it seemed important to name. "Yes," he said. And then, quieter, most of the time that feels like a condition. There are periods when it feels like a purpose. She thought about that. She thought about what it would mean to outlast everything you loved, to watch it go into the past and find yourself still present, still needing to do something with the time, to build a room underground with the right temperature and the right light and the right drawers, and to keep everything safe, and to wait. "Why are you showing me these?" she asked. "Because you wrote 4 letters," he said. "Because you cared about documents that most people don't think to care about." Because he stopped. Chose his next words carefully, the way he seemed to choose most things. "Because I've been managing this collection alone for a very long time, and I think some of what's here deserves more than management." "A reader," she said. "A reader," he agreed. "Someone who can sit with them and understand what they meant to the people who made them." Ilara looked at the letter, looked at the room, looked at him. "I'd need regular access," she said. "Scheduled sessions, proper cataloging protocols. I can't work from an unindexed collection. I'd need to design a cataloging system that accounts for the sensitivity of some of the content, which means a separate access tier structure, of course," he said. "And I'd need to understand more about what I'm handling. The historical context, which means more of what you told me the other day, about your family, about the chronology." "I know," he said. She stood up, carefully removed her cotton gloves, looked at the room one more time, at the careful light and the preserved things and the man standing in the middle of it all, keeping everything safe, alone. "Same time next week?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment, something in his face doing the thing again, the slow shifting, the door quality. "Yes," he said. "Same time next week." The weeks had a shape to them now that they hadn't had before. Ilara noticed this the way she noticed most gradual things after the fact, looking back and seeing the pattern that had formed while she was paying attention to individual details. Monday through Friday she was at the library, in her own archive, handling her own collection, answering emails and training the new junior staff member, and attending the departmental meetings that everyone found tedious, but that were, as her supervisor liked to say, the price of institutional belonging. Saturday mornings she worked on her manuscript paper, the one that had been 40 pages, and was now 62 and still growing. Saturday afternoon she went to the house on the hill. The Saturday afternoon visits had started as formal research sessions. They'd stayed that, but they'd also become something else, something she didn't have precise language for, something that existed alongside the professional framework, without disrupting it, but also without being entirely contained by it. She knew the house now. She knew that Vera had been with Cassian for 30 years, and had started working for him when she was 22, and had never, to Ilara's knowledge, asked the question that Ilara had asked on her second visit. She knew that the west wing of the 3rd floor was his private residence, and that she hadn't been invited there, and hadn't asked to be. She knew that he read constantly, that the books on his desk changed every week, that his tastes ranged from contemporary fiction to pre-Socratic philosophy, with a preference for anything concerned with the problem of duration, how things persisted, how they changed while persisting, how change and continuity coexisted in the same object over time. She could have told him she found that personally significant. She filed it in the category of things she wasn't ready to fully examine yet. The catalog had 43 entries now. 43 documents described. Dated. Provenanced. Cross-referenced. The collection had over 800 items, which at 43 meant she was making good progress by archival standards and would still be working on this for years. She found that she didn't mind this. She found, if she was honest, that the idea of finishing alarmed her slightly in a way that finishing projects didn't normally alarm her. It was a cold Saturday in late February when she found the second letter. It was in a drawer she hadn't opened before, toward the back of the room, below eye level. The folder inside it looked similar to the others, but thicker. She brought it to the examination table and opened it, and inside were not one but a series of letters, perhaps 20, tied with a faded ribbon that had once been red and had faded toward rust. The handwriting on all of them was the same author as the first letter she'd read, months ago. The same hand. She looked at the dates, written across 11 years. She read the first one, and the second. She was halfway through the third when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. She recognized them now. She knew the particular cadence of his approach, and he came into the room and stopped when he saw what she was holding. "You found those," he said. She looked up. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not quite distress. Something more controlled than distress. Something that had been managed for a long time, but hadn't been fully resolved. "I'm sorry," she said, immediately. "I should have asked." "No, you're cataloging. You have access to everything in this room." He came forward, sat in the chair on the far side of the table, the position they'd established over months, the professional distance. I'd just forgotten they were there. She looked at the letters. Looked at him. "The same person?" she said. "The first letter? The same person. She wrote to you for 11 years, she said. She hadn't meant it as an accusation. It emerged as a plain fact, stated simply, the way he stated plain facts. Yes, and you kept them all. Yes, she thought about that. Thought about what it was like to be kept. To have someone maintain across decades and centuries the physical evidence of what you'd been to them. The letter in the first folder. The declaration written once and preserved forever. These letters, written across 11 years, kept, was she started. She was extraordinary, he said. Quiet, not raw, but real. The truth of it evident not in volume, but in how simply he stated it. She was the most extraordinary person I'd known in 4 centuries, and she died of a fever in a cold spring, and there was nothing I could do about it. The archive was quiet around them, the careful light, the controlled temperature, the hum of the climate systems keeping everything safe. "I'm sorry," Alara said again. And then, 4 centuries is a long time to know people and lose them. He looked at her, the silver eyes in the warm light. "Yes," he said, "it is." She didn't put the letters down. She held them, the rust-red ribbon, the thin pages, the handwriting that had survived because someone had chosen to keep it. "Do you want me to catalog these?" she asked. "Or would you rather I left them as they are?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Catalog them," he said finally. She deserved, she would have wanted to be documented. She was a historian herself. She believed in the record. A pause. "She would have liked you." Alara looked at the letters, at the pages, at the evidence of someone who had mattered, preserved across centuries by someone who'd understood that mattering deserved to survive. "Then I'll do it properly," she said. "I'll give her the full treatment." Context, cross-references, annotation. He nodded. They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon. She catalogued. He read at the far end of the table. A contemporary novel. Something she'd recommended 3 weeks ago and forgotten about. They didn't speak much. Didn't need to. The room had that quality. The particular ease of a shared space with someone you trusted, the kind of ease that wasn't built but grown, that arrived one Saturday at a time until one day you looked up and found it fully present, without knowing exactly when it had arrived. She was packing up to leave when he said, without looking up from his book, "I'd like to show you something next week." "Upstairs. The library." "The library I've seen," she said. "Not all of it." She looked at him. "The third floor section," he said. "My personal collection. There are some pieces there that he stopped, that I've never shown anyone. That I think you'd want to see." She thought about the category of things she wasn't ready to examine yet. She thought about the growing list, the footsteps she now recognized, the chair that had become her chair, the tea that was ready when she arrived without being requested. "I'll see you next Saturday," she said. He looked up from the book, the slow shift in his face, the door quality. "Next Saturday," he agreed. The third floor was different from the rest of the house. Not darker, the light was the same quality, warm and considered but quieter, somehow more interior, the way the inner rooms of old buildings sometimes felt, as if the walls had been absorbing the specific texture of the life lived within them for so long that the absorption had become architectural. He led her through 2 rooms before the library, a sitting room, sparsely furnished, a single chair by a window that looked over the winter garden below, a study with a desk covered in correspondence and maps, some obviously current, some that she clocked as historical, and kept herself from stopping to examine only with significant effort. The personal library was at the end of the hall. It was a smaller room than the one downstairs, but the density was different. The books here weren't the collected range of someone who read widely across everything those were downstairs. These were deliberate. A curated collection, each book chosen for something specific. She could feel it in the arrangement, in the way the room's organization had a logic beneath its apparent lack of system. "These are yours," she said. "Not borrowed, not inherited, not managed. You read all of these." "Yes, how many times?" he considered. "Some once, some many times. There are books I've read once every 50 years since they were published." She walked slowly along one shelf. Poetry. A specific range of it, not the canonical sequence, not the expected collection, but something particular in the selection. She pulled one out, looked at it, put it back, pulled another. She was building a picture, the way she always built pictures of collections, through individual details accumulating into pattern. "You like things that try to explain time," she said, "or try to explain what it's like to be inside time. Duration, the specific experience of things continuing." He was quiet. "Because it's your problem," she said. "Time is your material condition. You live in it differently than everyone else. These are the writers who got closest to describing what that's like." "Yes," he said. She came to a shelf at eye level that held a different kind of book. Not literature, not philosophy. Journals, handwritten notebooks, dated on their spines, ranging, she checked several quickly, from the 16th century to the current decade. Dozens of them. "Yours?" she said. "Yes, you wrote journals." "I write journals," he said. Present tense, she looked at them, at the record of a life that spanned centuries, documented in its own hand, by a person who had understood, very early, that duration without recording was simply loss. "You're your own archivist," she said. He seemed to consider this. "I suppose I am." She turned, found him standing in the middle of the room, watching her move through his books in the focused way she had, the way that was entirely professional and entirely personal simultaneously, the way she'd come to look at everything in this house, with the particular attention that she gave to things she was beginning to understand were significant. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "I told you last week. There are pieces here that's not what I mean," she said. She turned to face him fully. "I mean all of it. The collection downstairs, the letters, the chronicle, your father's handwriting. And now this," She gestured at the room. "This is yours. This is the most private record of what your life has been. Why are you showing it to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because you understand keeping," he said finally. "Because you came back with 4 letters because you thought the documents deserved to be read, and when you found the letters you asked me if I wanted them cataloged before you touched them, and when I told you about someone I'd lost you said you were sorry in a way that meant you understood she deserved to be mourned." He paused. "Because every person who has ever come into this house has been someone who needed something from me, or who was afraid of me, or both." He looked at her directly. "You needed the collection, but you stopped needing it fairly quickly, and you kept coming back." Ilara held that. She thought about what she would say, and how she would say it. And she thought about the category of things she'd been refusing to examine, and she thought about the letters, the 11 years of correspondence kept in a drawer, and she thought about the specific shape that her weeks had taken on, and about how the thought of the catalog being finished alarmed her. "I stopped needing the collection," she said carefully, "but I kept finding reasons the collection needed me." Something in his face. The shifting, but faster this time. "That's different," he said quietly. "A little," she agreed. Neither of them moved. "I should tell you something," he said. He said it with the careful gravity of someone who had learned, over a very long time, the specific weight of important things, about what it means to become part of this world. My world. What it requires of people. "Tell me," she said. "It requires knowing that the duration is asymmetric," he said. "That you age and I don't. That anything that grows between us would have a horizon that I can see and you may not want to think about. I've learned, at considerable cost, that this is something that can't be navigated through not discussing it." Ilara looked at him. At the journals on the shelves behind him, the accumulated record of centuries, at the books chosen by someone trying to understand their own experience of time, at the man himself, who had loved someone across 11 years and kept every letter and built a room underground with the right temperature to keep the papers safe. "I'm an archivist," she said. "I think about mortality professionally. Things survive or they don't. The goal is to preserve what matters for as long as possible." She paused. "I understand the asymmetry. I'm not afraid of it. You should be, at least a little," he said. Not harshly, with the frank accuracy of someone who wanted her to go into this with full information. "Maybe," she said. "I'll let you know when I am." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was lit in this room too, low and steady. "There's a dinner," he said. "Next month. I'm required to attend certain gatherings, other families, old arrangements." He said it carefully. "I would like you to come with me, not as a researcher." Ilara felt something settle in her chest, the particular settling of a decision that has been made and acknowledged rather than deferred. "I'll need something to wear," she said. "That can be arranged. And you'll need to tell me who's going to be there," she said. "If I'm going to be introduced into your world, I want context. I want to understand what I'm walking into." "Yes," he said. "Of course." "Good," she said. She looked one more time around the room, at the evidence of a life documented and preserved against the long erosion of time. "Then, I'll see you next Saturday. And the Saturday after that. And the one after that. The door quality. Fully open now." "Yes," he said. "All of them." The gathering was held in a house older than his. She knew this instinctively when they arrived, the specific way old buildings announced themselves, the way the stone had a different density, the way the entrance was designed for a body of people and a social form that didn't quite exist anymore outside rooms like this one. She stood beside Cassian in the entrance hall and quietly cataloged what she was seeing, because cataloging was her way of managing newness, of building structure around the unfamiliar until it became graspable. There were perhaps 30 people in the room beyond. She'd expected them to look different, old, somehow, visibly marked by duration. They didn't. They looked entirely normal, except for the particular quality of attention that she'd first noticed in Cassian on the subway, the stillness, the sense of looking at things for longer than people usually did, the careful economy of movement that came from having had time to learn exactly how much motion was necessary. "The host is Maren Solberg," Cassian said quietly beside her. "She's the oldest person in the room. She'll assess you. Don't try to perform for her. She'll see through it immediately." "What should I do?" "Be exactly what you are," he said. "What you always are." She looked at him. "What am I?" A small pause. "Somebody who reads things honestly," he said. "It's rarer than you'd think." They moved into the room. She met Maren Solberg 20 minutes later. Maren was seated in a high-backed chair near the fire, not out of weakness, but in the specific way of someone who'd decided this was where they were sitting, and had no interest in adjusting. She was small, silver-haired, in a way that suggested the choice rather than the condition, and she had eyes that were very pale and entirely direct. She looked at Alara for a long moment before saying anything. "Cassian," she said, without looking at him. "She's calmer than I expected. She's an archivist," Cassian said. "That explains several things. To Alara, sit. I have questions." Alara sat. She wasn't frightened. She noticed this again, the same way she'd noticed it in the library that first evening, not bravado, not performance, just an accurate reading of her own state. She was alert, interested, and quite genuinely curious about what questions a 1,000-year-old woman would want to ask her. "You work with old documents," Maren said. "Yes, so you understand that old things require different handling than new ones, that you can't approach something ancient with contemporary assumptions. It's the central discipline of my field," Alara said. Maren looked at her for another moment. "And Cassian," she said. "Does he strike you as something that requires different handling?" "Yes," Alara said. "Though I think different handling is not exactly right. He requires accurate handling, the kind that accounts for what he actually is, rather than what's convenient to project onto him." Maren was quiet for a moment. Something in her face shifted, a very slight shift, barely visible. "She'll do," she said to Cassian. Simply, conclusively, the evening progressed. Alara met others, some who were curious, a few who were cautious. One young-looking man who'd been alive since the 14th century and who spent an earnest 20 minutes discussing medieval manuscript culture with her, because she was the first archivist he'd ever met at one of these gatherings. She ate, she drank, she listened carefully. Cassian stayed near her without hovering. She noticed the specific calibration of his presence, enough to anchor her in an unfamiliar room without making her feel managed. She thought about the category of things she hadn't examined. She thought about 11 years of letters in a drawer. On the way home, in the car, the city moving past the windows, he said, "How are you?" "Good," she said. "Actually, good. Maren is extraordinary." "She is," she said. "I'd do." High praise from Maren. Alara looked at the city outside, the streets she'd lived in for 6 years, familiar and rearranged now, seen through a different lens. The way the city felt like it had depth she hadn't known about, layers beneath the visible that she'd been given access to. "I have a question," she said. "Yes, the woman who wrote you the letters. For 11 years, she watched the streetlights. Was she the last person you brought into this world? Before me?" He was quiet for a moment. She didn't press. She waited, the way she'd learned to wait with documents that needed time, that would yield what they contained if you were patient rather than forced. "There were others, after her," he said. "People I allowed closer, trusted." A pause. "None of them the access I've given you. The archive. The journals. None of them saw that." She turned to look at him. He was looking forward, at the road. "Why me?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the car moved through several blocks of city before he answered. "Because you took the coat back," he said finally. Most people, given a coat by a stranger in a snowstorm, would keep it, would rationalize keeping it. The cold, the circumstances, the anonymity. He paused. "You came back the next day because you thought the right thing was to return what didn't belong to you." That's another pause, the careful word choosing. That's the quality I've been looking for a very long time, without knowing exactly what I was looking for. Ilara held that. She turned back to the window. "You've been keeping things safe for a long time," she said. "Yes, and waiting," she said, "for something you couldn't entirely name." The silence had a quality she recognized now, from months of Saturday afternoons in rooms full of preserved things. The quality of something finally finding the right container. "Yes," he said. Winter gave way to an early, tentative spring. Ilara noticed it the way she noticed the seasons from inside a library, not through direct experience of the weather first, but through the change in light, the way the windows admitted something warmer and more horizontal, the way the air when she arrived on Saturdays had a different quality. Something green and provisional coming off the garden through the gate. The garden was waking up. She'd seen it only in its winter state, the bare bones of it, the structure without the substance. Now it was beginning to fill in, and what it was filling into was extraordinary. She could see this even from the path. The early growth of something that had been designed with real intelligence, old roses against the south-facing stone, the remnants of a kitchen garden to the east, a path through the middle that was original. She'd bet anything it was original. The worn stones embedded in a pattern that belonged to an earlier century's sensibility about what a garden should do. She started arriving early enough to walk through it before going inside. This had happened gradually, the way most things with Cassian happened. She'd arrived one Saturday to find the gate open and the path clear, and she'd walked through on impulse, and he'd found her standing in the far corner looking at something she thought might be a medieval apothecary planting. And after that, the gate was always open when she arrived. He joined her some Saturdays. They walked the paths while he explained what things had been, what they were becoming, what the garden had looked like in different decades. She listened and asked questions. She thought about duration. She thought about the particular kind of knowledge that came from watching the same garden through multiple centuries, knowing every permutation, every loss, every return. The archive was at 214 entries now. She'd started a secondary project that she hadn't planned, a contextual history of the Vale family written entirely from internal documents, using the catalog as its backbone. It wasn't something she could publish. The circumstances of its creation were not ones she could explain in a standard academic framework, but she was writing it anyway, because the story it told deserved to be told, and she was the person who understood it fully enough to tell. Cassian had found her working on it one afternoon, read the opening pages, and said nothing for a long while. "You don't have to," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I want to." He had that quality again. The open door. It was on a Saturday in April, the garden fully awake around them, the old roses pushing new growth against the stone, that he said, "There's something you should know about what's been happening outside this house." She looked at him. "There's a faction," he said. It was said with the particular neutralness of someone reporting on a long-standing problem they had well-managed opinions about. Old families who disagree with how I've chosen to live. The degree of openness. The human contact. He paused. "Your visits haven't gone unnoticed." Ilara absorbed this. "What does that mean, practically?" "It means I want to be honest with you about what access to my world involves," he said. "It involves me. It also involves the politics that attach to me, that I'd rather you weren't required to navigate, but that you should understand exist." She thought about Marin's question. Does he strike you as something that requires different handling? She thought about what accurate handling actually meant, in full. "What do they want?" she said. "For me to demonstrate that my arrangements are private." Controlled, He said it with a slight quality of distaste. For you to be positioned as classified, in their terminology, either as someone under formal arrangement or as someone who has no legitimate access. And what do you want? She said. He was quiet. In the spring garden, the new roses moving slightly in a mild wind, the city below the hill going about its ordinary business. I want you to have the choice, he said. That's what I want. I want to tell you what exists, what's possible, and I want you to decide without pressure from me or from anyone else what you want to do with that information. She looked at the garden, the apothecary corner, the worn stone path, the south-facing roses. What are the options? She said. He laid them out clearly, the way he laid most things out, with precision and without sentiment obscuring the practical content. There were formal arrangements that carried protection within vampire society, but required things she'd need to understand fully. There was no arrangement, which meant continuing as she was, which had certain risks he wanted her to understand, and there were things that were irreversible, transformations, that she was nowhere near having to consider, and that he was not raising as pressure, only as complete information. She listened to all of it. Give me the week, she said. Of course. She walked home through the spring city, past the university library where she'd worked for 6 years, past the bus stop where she took the bus she'd been taking every day for 3 years, past the coffee shop on the corner that knew her order, the city of her ordinary life, mapped and familiar. She looked at it and thought about what it contained that she'd thought it contained 3 months ago, and what she knew now it also contained. She thought about the letters in the rust-red ribbon. She thought about what it meant to be kept, not managed, not possessed. Kept, preserved against the loss that time always brought to everything it touched. By Tuesday, she'd made her decision. She arrived on Saturday not in the afternoon, but in the morning, early before the usual time, and Cassian opened the door himself before she'd reached it, and she understood from the fact of this, from the steady quality of his face looking at her, that he already knew. I want the formal arrangement, she said, not because of the faction, because I want to be here properly, with full standing. She paused. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her for a long moment. It binds in both directions, he said. You should know that. It's not only protection for you, it's a formal declaration of claim. Mutual claim. I know, she said. I read everything you gave me. He was quiet. I'm an archivist, she said. I don't agree to anything I haven't read thoroughly. Something in his face released. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time. Come in, he said. She stepped over the threshold. The ceremony was small. She'd expected formality, and there was formality. The structure of it was old. A specific arrangement of words and witnessed presence that had been the same, Cassian told her, since before several of the languages she spoke had existed in their current form, but the scale was intimate. Marin was present. Vera, 2 others from the April gathering who Ilara had come to know in the subsequent months. Quiet people. Old. The kind of old that had become simply themselves rather than notable. She wore her own clothes. There was no ritual costume, no specific garment required. She stood in the library downstairs, in front of the fireplace where she'd first read the Chronicle, in a dark blue dress she'd bought for a departmental dinner 2 years ago, and Cassian stood across from her, and the words that were said were old and meant what they said, which was simply, I claim this person. This person claims me. This is witnessed and real. After, Marin embraced her. The others nodded with the particular gravity of people for whom witnessed commitments meant something that couldn't be diluted by time. Vera brought champagne. Later, when the others had gone and the house was quiet, she and Cassian sat in the library. The fire, the books, the room that had been the first room, the one that had started this. How do you feel? He asked. The same, she said. Exactly the same, but more settled. She thought about it. Like something that was conditional has become unconditional. He nodded. I've been thinking about the contextual history, she said. The one I've been writing from the archive. Yes, I want to include this period, she said. As part of the record. Anonymous. Obviously, personal details altered, but the shape of it, how the archive was opened, what it contained, how the access developed, I think it belongs in the record. For whoever reads it after. He was quiet for a moment. She would have done the same thing, he said. The woman from the letters. Not as a comparison, as a recognition of something they shared. She always said that the things you chose to keep were the most honest record of what you valued. Alara thought about that. About keeping, and what it meant, and how the same word could mean the static preservation of a past thing, and the active, daily maintenance of a living one. Tell me more about her, she said. He looked at her. Tell me about what she was like, she said. Not for the archive, just for me. Because she mattered to you, and things that mattered to you, I want to know them. He was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He told her about a woman named Cecily, who had been a historian in the 18th century when the word barely existed in its current sense, who had understood that the past was not static, who had found him in the reading room of an institution that no longer existed, and had asked him questions about his sources with the same focused precision that Alara used on documents she was trying to date. He talked for a long time. The fire burned down, and she didn't prompt Vera to restock it, and it didn't matter, because the room was warm, with another kind of warmth. When he finished, she said, "She sounds extraordinary." She was, he said. So are you. Differently, but genuinely. She looked at him. I want to see the journals, she said. The ones from that period. Not for the catalog, for understanding you. He stood without hesitation, walked upstairs, came back with 3 volumes, a small fraction of the shelf, and set them on the table beside her with the particular care of someone offering something real. She opened the first one. His handwriting was older in this one, not in legibility but in character, the handwriting of someone slightly less settled in themselves. She read slowly, the way she read everything in this house. Carefully, honestly. They stayed there until late, she reading, he reading beside her, the city outside going dark, and then quiet, and then beginning to suggest morning at the edges of the windows. She thought about the snowstorm, about a coat that had found her on a sidewalk and been returned the next morning because she believed in returning what wasn't hers, about the address on a card, the gate opening, the archive below ground, the first letter tied in rust-red ribbon. She thought about what she'd walked into on that cobblestone hill without knowing she was walking into anything. How a snowstorm had rearranged the map of her world, and how the rearranged map was more accurate than the previous one. I'm going to need to tell Petra, she said. He looked up from his book. Your colleague. She thinks I've been attending a very demanding series of research sessions. She looked at him. I'm going to need to tell her something closer to the truth. What will you tell her? That I met someone, she said, and that the collection he let me work on is going to be the most significant archival project of my career. She paused. Both of those things are true. Both of those things are true, he agreed. She went back to the journal. Outside, the city began its early sounds, delivery vehicles and distant trains, and the particular acoustic shift of a world waking up. The fire was low. The library was warm. The books stood in their shelves, patient and full. Alara Voss, archivist, 28, read the handwriting of a man who had been writing down his life since before her field existed, and felt the specific satisfaction of things being where they belonged. Summer arrived, and with it a different quality of Saturdays. The garden was in full life now, she could see this, from the moment she came through the gate, the roses at their peak. The kitchen garden productive in the earnest way of things that had been properly attended to. the path through the center of it, giving the whole thing its sense of order beneath abundance. She'd taken to spending an extra hour in it before going inside, sitting on the bench near the apothecary corner with her notebook, writing the contextual history, the garden around her, providing a particular quality of stillness that she hadn't found anywhere else. Cassian joined her sometimes. They had a rhythm now. The way people who spent real time together developed rhythms. The small unconscious accommodations. The particular shorthand that grew up between two people who had paid genuine attention to each other. He knew she needed her first 30 minutes on arrival to decompress from the week, that she thought best in silence with paper rather than typing, that she went quiet and productive after the second cup of tea. She knew that he read in the morning and thought in the late afternoon, and that his humor, which was dry and precise and emerged rarely enough to be arresting, was most likely to appear when he was relaxed and slightly tired. She had moved more of her things to the house on the hill. Not fully. Her apartment was still hers. She'd negotiated this with herself carefully, the archivist's instinct for maintaining the complete provenance trail, not losing the through line of who she'd been before. But her second monitor was here now, and her reference books, and the specific blanket from her couch that she'd brought for working in the archive on cold days, and that had migrated to the chair in the library upstairs and stayed. Petra knew. Not all of it, but enough. Petra had responded to the partial truth, the way colleagues who'd known you for years responded with the particular kind of knowing acceptance that said, "I had a feeling something like this was happening. I'm glad it's going well. Please tell me more when you're ready." The research credentials had been updated. The access documentation was in order. Ilara had a legitimate institutional footprint in the Vielle collection now, which she found she cared about, not for professional reasons, but for the same reason she'd cared about returning the coat. Things should be accurately documented. The record should reflect the reality. The faction that Cassian had mentioned in April had been quiet. She asked him about this in midsummer, sitting in the garden with their respective reading, the afternoon long and warm. The formal arrangement resolved most of it, he said. My position is clear now. There are those who remain opposed to the principle of human involvement, but the formal arrangement means any challenge to your presence becomes a challenge to me directly. Most of the objectors prefer their opposition theoretical rather than practical. Most of them, she noted. Yes, he said. She looked at him over her book. Tell me about the ones who don't, he told her, with the same precision and calm he applied to everything, about a small number of old families who held to a strict view of separation between the vampire world and the human world, who saw what Cassian had built as a contamination rather than an enrichment, who believed the archives should be closed, the records private, the line between the worlds maintained as rigidly as it had been before the previous century's gradual, careful opening. What do they do with that belief? She asked. Generally they object at gatherings, he said. Write correspondence. Attend the right events and make their displeasure known. A pause. There have been instances of stronger action historically. I want you to know what's possible without overstating the likelihood. What kind of stronger action? He met her eyes. Interference with human connections. Pressure applied to people in a human's life, making the connection untenable from the outside rather than the inside. Ilara thought about this. Thought about Petra, about her supervisor, about the university library, and the records and the life she'd spent 6 years building. My work, she said. Potentially, he said. I have precautions in place, but I want you to know this exists. She was quiet for a moment. Have they interfered before? She said. With people before. He was quiet. Once, he said. With Cecily? A pause. With someone after Cecily. Someone I should have protected better. The afternoon light moved through the garden. A bee moved from rose to rose in the unhurried way of things with sufficient time and good reason. What happened? She asked. She was a teacher, he said. a remarkable one. They pressured her employer, made certain documents public that compromised her professional reputation. She wasn't frightened of them, she was like you in that way, but the practical damage was real, and I didn't anticipate it clearly enough. What happened to her? She left the city, he said. We maintained contact for years, but the access to this world that ended, not by her choice, by mine. He said it plainly. I misjudged. I moved too slowly, and someone was hurt. I won't repeat that. Alara looked at him, at the quality of his face when he said this, the old regret that wasn't fresh but was still present, the error sitting somewhere in him that several centuries hadn't quite resolved. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, he said, but I want you to know that I'm more careful now. That I understand what's required. She looked at the garden, at the thing he'd built and maintained and kept through every season, the structure beneath, the deep roots. What do you need from me? She asked. Practically, to help. He seemed to consider this as a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. Continue exactly as you are, he said finally. Your credibility, your institutional record, the legitimacy of the research, that's the protection. It makes the interference harder to execute without making things worse for them. He paused. And tell me if anything feels wrong. If something happens at work that seems strange, if you feel watched in a way you don't recognize. Tell me before it becomes a problem. Agreed, she said. They went back to their reading. The afternoon moved through its long summer hours. The garden kept its steady, alive patience around them, growing in the specific way of things that had good roots and good tending and enough time. She thought about the snowstorm, about the 4 blocks and the coat and a card pressed into her hand. How small that moment had been, how unremarkable from the outside, a woman in a snowstorm and a man who happened to be standing on the right patch of sidewalk. How the small, unremarkable moments were the ones that actually changed the structure of things. She wrote 3 more pages of the contextual history. She described the garden as it was now in summer, and as it had been in winter, the first time she'd seen it, and she thought about how the same place could be so entirely different depending on the season, and how what made it the same was the structure underneath, the roots, the care. That evening, when the sun went low and the garden went golden, Cassian looked up from his book and said, without preamble, I'm glad you came back with the coat. She looked at him. The silver eyes, the stillness, the man who had been writing down his life since the 12th century, and who had kept everything that mattered, and who had built a room underground with the right temperature to preserve what was worth preserving. So am I, she said. The garden settled into evening. The roses held their color for a long moment against the fading light. The letter she found in October was addressed to her. She discovered it in the archive on a Tuesday. She'd started coming on Tuesdays as well, a midweek session, the catalog now at 347 entries, in a drawer she'd opened a dozen times before. It was in a folder she recognized, one she'd cataloged 2 months ago, but the letter on top was new, placed there deliberately, her name on the outside in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Not Cassian's. The script was old, not aged in the way the documents beneath it were aged, not historical, just old in the way of someone whose handwriting had been formed in an era when handwriting was formed differently, with the particular slope and weight of a much earlier century. She stood at the examination table for a moment, her cotton gloves on, the letter in her hands, understanding before she fully processed it that she was holding something that had not been written by a living person. She opened it carefully. The text inside was in English, contemporary English, which meant it had been written for her specifically, rather than translated or transcribed. It was not long, 2 paragraphs and a closing line. It began, I am told you are an archivist, and that you understand what it means to read the record honestly. So I will write to you honestly, one archivist to another. She read it standing up, at the examination table, the way she read everything in this room. The writer was Cecily, the woman from the letters, the historian, the woman Cassian had spoken about through a long winter evening, whose letters lived in a drawer with a rust-red ribbon. The letter explained, with the clarity of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say for a long time, that she had asked Cassian to place it in the archive in the event that there was ever a reader who had access to the collection and to the letters, and who needed to know something. What she needed to know was this: he is someone who learns from loss, who becomes more careful, more present, more honest with each grief. I have been watching for some time, as much as one can watch from where I am, and what I see in this record, your careful entries, the history you're writing is someone who has finally allowed themselves to be known. That's not a small thing. It's the thing I failed to give him completely, and I have been sorry for that longer than you will live. The final line: you returned the coat. I have been hoping, for a very long time, that someone would return the coat. Elara set the letter down on the table. Her hands were steady. She stood in the careful light, the climate-controlled air, the room full of preserved things. She thought about what it meant that Cecily had asked for this, had planned for a future reader, a specific kind of reader, had believed enough in the possibility of this moment to write toward it from wherever she was. The archivist's faith in the future, the act of writing not for the present, but for the person who would come after, who would need the record. She thought about the coat. About the cold, about the sidewalk, and the card, and the cobblestone hill, and the gate opening. She thought about the chronicle upstairs, the one written across centuries in the same careful hand, documenting everything from plague to ordinary Tuesdays, the record of a life lived fully in time. She thought about the journals on the third floor, the decades and centuries of documented days. She thought about the letters in the rust-red ribbon, 11 years of correspondence kept in the drawer of a man who understood that keeping was a form of love. She sat down. She opened her notebook. She began writing the next section of the contextual history, the October entry, the letter, the discovery, and she wrote it the way she wrote everything in this house, with complete honesty, giving the record exactly what had happened and what it had meant. When Cassian came downstairs an hour later and saw her writing at the examination table, he stopped in the doorway. He saw the letter, recognizable, his face making its slow adjustment. "You found it," he said. "I found it." He came into the room, sat across from her, looked at the letter and then at her face, reading it with the careful attention he gave to things he wanted to understand fully. "She asked me to place it years ago," he said, "before I knew who you were." She described the kind of person who would eventually have access to the full collection, the qualities they would have. He paused. "She described you with enough accuracy that when you arrived I recognized it." Elara looked at him. "The coat," she said. "The coat," he said. "She told me to give a coat to someone if a moment came that seemed right, that the right person would return it. She held that. The specific quality of a plan made by someone who had loved him and known him well and had spent considerable effort arranging, from whatever came after, for him to be found by someone who would understand him. She was extraordinary," Elara said. "She was," he said. "She would have been good at this," Elara said. "What I'm doing. The contextual history. Better than most," he said. "Possibly better than me. Possibly as good as me," Elara said. Something in his face. Not the slow shifting this time. Something faster. Something almost unguarded. The smile that usually lived in the neighborhood of his face finally arriving. It changed everything about him. She filed this in the growing catalog of things she wanted to understand fully. "I want to write a section about her," she said. "A proper one. Using the letters, her voice, her work, her contribution to this archive and to you. She paused. With your permission. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. She nodded, looked at the letter on the table, at the handwriting of a woman who had looked forward from the 18th century and had seen this room, this table, this afternoon. Thank you, she said to the letter. She picked up her pen. Outside, the October city was doing what October cities did, shedding, cooling, preparing for the long lean season, but inside the room with the right temperature and the right light, and the 347 documented things, and the careful record of a life still being written, it was warm. It would stay warm. Elara intended to make sure of it. She wrote. The pen moved. The archive grew by one more entry, a letter placed in hope, found in trust, by the person it had been written for. The record complete. In the entry she noted the condition of the paper, the composition of the ink, the script style and its estimated period, the probable date of writing, the chain of custody, all the standard archival information, accurate and thorough. And at the bottom, in the notes field, she wrote, "This document was placed with intention. It arrived exactly as it was meant to." She thought that was honest. She thought Cecily would have approved.